Hi, I'm Jim Hightower, and I'm hoping that you will tune in to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour because it will turn you radioactive.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Welcome, Ralph.
Yeah, hello, everybody. This is a very intensive program that you're not going to hear much in other media.
Our first guest today is Megan Greenwell, a journalist and the author of Bad Company, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream. You know, when I think of private equity, I immediately think of Mitt Romney and Bain Capital, snatching up companies and selling off their parts. According to Ms. Greenwell, private equity controls our hospitals, daycare centers, supermarket chains, voting machine manufacturers, local newspapers, nursing home operators, fertility clinics, and prisons. The industry even manages highways, municipal water systems, fire departments, emergency medical service, and owns a growing swath of commercial and residential real estate. And the barons of private equity are some of the wealthiest people in America who have outsized influence on our politics and legislation. What could go wrong? We'll find out with Megan Greenwell. Then we welcome back James Zogby, co-founder and president of the Arab American Institute. We'll speak to him about the ongoing Israeli attacks on Lebanon. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhyber. But first, let's examine yet another manifestation of corporate greed. Hannah?
Megan Greenwell is a journalist who has written or edited for publications including The New York Times, The Washington Post, New York Magazine, Wired, and ESPN. She is also the deputy director of the Princeton Summer Journalism Program, a workshop and college access initiative for students from low-income backgrounds. She is the author of Bad Company, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Megan Greenwell.
Oh, thank you all so much for having me. It's such an honor.
Thank you very much, Megan. I liked your dedication for your book. It reads, quote, "For Dad, who was always the first to believe I could do it," end quote. And since Steve and David have daughters, I think they would like this dedication as well. Rather unusual.
Thank you. Yeah, my dad, who died in 2021, was a pretty special guy who really rooted me on. And I should say, a big fan of yours.
Thank you. I want to hold the audience. The audience may say, oh, no, private equity, this is too abstract and too technical. I'm going to turn the dial. So let me induce you, listeners, not to turn the dial by reading a short paragraph at the end of Megan's book, preceded by the following poll that she notices. 2024 poll found that 71% said wealth inequality is a serious national issue, including 56% of Republicans. And in the last paragraph, Megan writes, quote, "Even if private equity doesn't own your employer or your home, it may well control your dentist's office, your children's preschool, your grandmother's nursing home, or your public utilities. The industry's rapid expansion has given firms and their executives scores of new ways to line their own pockets at the expense of American workers, but it has also created scores of new people who can finally see the monster through the window. If it doesn't play a role in your life yet, just wait. Private equity is everybody's problem now," end quote. So my first question is this. We're not going to get people interested in this if we use their word, private equity. Private means something good. Equity means fairness. I would like a better term, like corporate raiders or something. Do you have a better term?
I mean, corporate raiders is a pretty good one. That was what we as a society called them in the 80s, in the era of Wall Street, the film. And for obvious reasons, private equity wanted to move away from that, which they did pretty effectively. Now, interestingly, the private equity world's biggest lobbying group won't use the words private equity either. They call themselves American Investment Council. But I do think, yes, corporate raiders is a nice, straightforward description of what they do.
Okay, so let's give it a corporate face. Tell me the names of some of the biggest so-called private equity companies, and I think more of our listeners will recognize them.
Yeah, so in the US, the biggest ones are Carlyle, Blackstone, KKR is a huge one, TPG, CVC, a lot of these acronyms that you sort of see on buildings, even if you don't necessarily know what they are. Bain Capital, which was founded by Mitt Romney, is another big one.
How about BlackRock?
So BlackRock is not technically a private equity firm, though they do have a private equity arm.
I see. They have like $12 trillion investments they're managing. It's the biggest in the world, I think.
Yes, exactly.
So,
right now, KKR is the biggest solely private equity firm in the world. I think they've raised 117. I don't even know how much it is, but they're absolutely massive. And all of these companies are absolutely massive. And as individuals, their executives are many of the richest people in the country.
Now, what percent of workers work for private equity firms in the U.S.?
At the time that I wrote my book, it was about 8%. I think it's grown a little bit since then. So we could say in the 9-10% range.
So that's over 12 million workers, and they're expanding rapidly. Now, can you explain to our listeners exactly how does this business work? I mean, how do they take over companies? How do they strip mine them? And you say in your book they can almost never lose money. They're corporate victims, and the workers are the ones that lose the money. That's not supposed to be a principle of capitalism. Can you explain? How does it work?
Yeah. You've written so well about the myths of market fundamentalism and how some of these things actually violate what we think of as classic free market capitalism. And I think private equity is the perfect example of that. So the way the deals work, the deals are called leveraged buyouts, and private equity firms combine money raised from outside investors. So that's public pension funds, university endowments, state sovereign wealth funds, et cetera, and combine that with bank loans to buy companies. The bank loans make up between 70 and 80% of any given deal. And the real trick with private equity, and this was the thing that made me want to write a book on it, is that when they take out those billions of dollars worth of loans, if you're buying a bigger company, the private equity firm is not responsible for paying those loans back. Only the portfolio company in whose name the private equity firm has taken the money out is on the hook for that money. And so what you end up with is this split in incentives where what's good for the private equity firm is not necessarily what's good for its own portfolio company.
Megan, how do they get a foothold in taking over a company if the company executives don't want to be taken over?
So they are very often the bidder making the highest offer on a company. And boards, in many cases, have an obligation, a legal obligation, to take the highest offer, regardless of whether they think it's in the best long-term interest in the company. So what you end up with in a lot of cases, and I've talked to board members who have been in this position, the board doesn't want to take the deal, but their hands are sort of tied, and the private equity firm knows they can make this money back, so offering the highest bid is not that big of a problem for them.
Well, when they take it over, who owns it?
There are companies in which private equity is just an investor, but in leveraged buyouts, what we're talking about is a private equity firm buying a company outright. So they are the sole owner of that company.
They don't use their money. They use what money?
They use this money from outside investors, but most of it is just straight bank loans. And so that's where the real problem comes in, because they're taking out these bank loans that the firm itself then has no obligation to pay back.
You know, I read that part where you said most of them are bank loans, and it puzzled me because, for example, Yale University has billions of dollars in private credit from its endowment.
Yes.
Big pension funds have billions of dollars. What proportion comes from pension funds and endowments, university and other endowments, compared to bank loans?
So the average deal, about 20 to 30% of it is from all those investors combined. So to your point, Yale, has billions and billions of dollars in, but that doesn't mean they have a huge percentage of any given deal. That just means that they're in it for a huge amount spread among many deals. But the vast majority of any given leveraged buyout, the money is coming from the bank loans, not from those investors.
Now, a rule of capitalism is you risk making a lot of money and you risk losing a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to obey the verdict of the marketplace in a competitive system. That's the ideal. And you say in your book that it's almost impossible for these corporations that you call private credit, or we can call corporate raiders, to lose any money.
Mm-hmm.
How is that?
So there are many different ways. I mean, one is that they're not investing very much of their own money at all, right? Because so much of any given deal is these bank loans, and they're not responsible for the bank loans. So they're just not on the hook for very much. But then also, the classic payment structure of private equity deals is known as 2 and 20. The private equity firm gets 20% of all profits in a given year, but at least profits require a profit, right? But they get a 2% management fee. That's 2% of the total value of the deal every single year, whether they are leading the company to great prosperity or driving it into the ground. So that's one big thing. The tax breaks are obviously huge. The carried interest loophole allows them to get off the hook for paying massive, massive taxes, which just, of course, gooses their own profits.
Let's examine this esoteric term,
Sure.
carried interest. And I want to ask you to define it in simple terms, like anybody who knows what a real estate agent makes and pays the full personal income tax for the fee selling the house. Make it as clear as you can, Megan. And then I want to ask you who is against it and why it hasn't been repealed by Congress, because it's costing taxpayers $10 billion a year. It's not cheap. So
Yes.
define it first.
So I actually think this is a rare case in which going to the history of the concept actually makes it more interesting and more easily understood rather than less. The idea of carried interest comes from ships. So ships were taxed on what they were carrying, but they were taxed at a lower rate because it wasn't guaranteed that all of the goods they were carrying would make it, right?
Centuries ago, right?
This is centuries ago. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So for some reason, we applied this fairly reasonable concept to financial firms, meaning that when they make profits, because they are just then reinvesting that money, those are treated not as normal profits like any business would make, but rather as potential profits. And so the tax rate on quote unquote carried interest is significantly lower than it would be on a business's profits, and like to your point about a real estate agent, on anybody's salary, right? I pay my annual taxes as a freelancer, and I am taxed on the entirety of my income, as personal profit, essentially.
We're talking with Megan Greenwell, the author of the book Bad Company, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream. Very clearly written, by the way. It's not esoteric, very clearly written. But instead of paying what percent on their earnings, what do they end up paying? What rate? Tell our listeners the numbers.
Yeah, carried interest tax rates top out at 20%. So in a lot of situations, you're paying less than that, but it will never be more than 20%. The ordinary income tax rate tops out at 37%. So that's a 17 percentage point difference, which if you're talking about profits in the millions and billions of dollars, is in fact costing taxpayers $10 billion a year, because that is exactly the money that we could be using for all of the valuable services that our federal government funds. But that 17-point difference ends up adding up to a ton of money.
Now, just about everybody is against this. Big-time billionaires have spoken against it. Joe Biden has spoken against it. Republican politicians have spoken against it. The entire accounting profession thinks it's a ridiculous distortion, that it should be taxed like ordinary income and not capital gains income, which is, as you say, topped at 20%. Why didn't Congress repeal it?
Basically because Congress is in the pocket of the private equity industry. So 88% of members of the House and Senate take donations from private equity. Interestingly, Donald Trump has called twice for the carried interest loophole to be closed. And still, even he, as much of a stranglehold as he has on the Republican Party, he can't build support for it among Republicans because they're all taking private equity money, as are the vast majority of the Democrats. So this is not a partisan issue. The last time there was a serious effort to close the carried interest loophole was in one of the pandemic relief bills, and it came so close to passing. And then Kirsten Sinema from Arizona, who was at the time one of the top recipients of private equity donations, made sure that it was going to get taken out of the bill in order for her vote, which they needed her vote to pass the bill. So that was in 2021. That was the last time there was real discussion about it. I expect it to be one of those things that keeps coming up every few years, but without a pretty dramatic change in the composition of Congress, I don't see it happening anytime soon. I mean, in many cycles, Chuck Schumer is the single biggest recipient of private equity donations.
That's certainly an explanation. My take on it is that there isn't a single person in Washington, D.C. lobbying full-time to repeal it, going up on Capitol Hill the way all the lobbyists go. And the politicians who've come out against it, they didn't use any political influence or leverage. They just made a statement. Because as you said, most of their adherents on Capitol Hill are taking money from the so-called private credit industry.
Right.
So when we talk about how hard it is to get rid of it, well, it failed by one vote. That Arizona senator you mentioned, she held out. Had she voted on the tax bill, she would have been a hero, and carried interest would have been repealed. And it would never have been very easy to reenact it in Congress because it's so outrageous. It's only Congress that's going to relieve these abuses that you write about so eloquently in the book. It's the last stop, so to speak, for readers to answer the question, what can I do about this? Well, you can go to your two senators and representatives. They're the ones who helped cause it, and they're the ones who can help resolve it. In that context, Megan, I want to read for everyone listening an extraordinary statement in 1937 before the Subcommittee on the Judiciary by the famous U.S. historian Charles Beard. And he said the following, and this excerpt I'm going to read should be read to every middle school and high school student who are already being abused by corporations. Here's historian Charles Beard. Quote, I should like to emphasize the fact that our state and national governments have a responsibility for the corporate abuses and economic distress in which we now flounder. It is a matter of common knowledge that corporations are not natural persons. They are artificial persons. They are the creatures of government. Only with the sanction of government can they perform any acts, good or bad. The corporate abuses which have occurred, the concentration of wealth which has come about under their operations, all can be laid directly and immediately at the door of government. The states of the American Union and the Congress of the United States, by their action and inaction, have made possible the situation and the calamities in which we now find ourselves, end quote. Stated in the middle of the Depression in 1937 before the Congress. Your reaction?
I mean, that really nails it. I don't remember reading that in high school or college, but I think it's a really important one. And I think you're right that Congress is uniquely positioned to change those circumstances that are as true now as they were in the 1930s. Although I would push back on the idea that Congress is our only hope. One of the reasons I was really interested to write this book as a series of narrative profiles of people trying to do something about it is none of them are trying to do something about it through the federal government. And I think when we talk about only the federal government can save us, we really risk turning people away from trying to do anything. And I think we've seen on the private equity issue, there has been some really interesting movement on the state level in several places, real reforms that are much easier to accomplish on the state level than on the federal level. In fact, tomorrow I'm talking to a group of legislators in Connecticut, in your home state, about some bills that they're trying to get through. So I think that is an absolutely prophetic speech about the circumstances in which we now find ourselves. And also, I think there are ways in which we can make an impact with or without the federal government.
Yes, you notice, fairness to Mr. Beard, he did mention the states as well.
Yes.
In his statement. Now, you talk quite a bit about Milton Friedman's theory that the only duty corporations have is to increase the value of their shareholders' money. And I'm a little quizzical about why you gave him such a stature. He's a notorious abstract number person. He did win the Nobel Prize, but when I debated him, I think I've debated him twice, I find it very easy to take him out of circulation in the debate. All I did was bring him down from his abstraction ladder to the concrete situation where people live, work, and raise their families. So why did you give him such stature?
So what's interesting to me about Milton Friedman is not that I think his theories are correct, and not that I even necessarily think he has earned that stature, but it is indisputable that he has that stature among the American economic right. So you can see very clearly, I think, how private equity grew out of his theories, grew out of shareholder primacy, the idea that the only point of a business is to make money for its shareholders. That is indisputably one of the most powerful theories in the history of American economics. Again, saying nothing about the merit of that theory, but just tracing the history of how much it created our modern day system. And so the reason I wanted to write about Friedman in the book is because I think the private equity system all traces back to Friedman, and that simultaneously, I think what the private equity system has become is actually a corruption of Friedman's style economics, right? For several reasons. One is it's not free market economics at all, as we talked about. But another is, even in that essay, and I do think it is worth reading the essay for listeners who haven't read it before, just because it's so influential. But in that essay, he specifically creates a carve out for businesses that have a charitable purpose. And he specifically names education and hospitals. Education and hospitals are two of the biggest areas of investment for private equity these days. So even if we take Milton Friedman's fairly extreme theories at face value, what private equity has created is far past what he even dreamed of.
Well, to be fair to Dr. Friedman, his essay has not been always interpreted accurately, because although he said the sole responsibility of business is to make money for their shareholders, he did say it's also their responsibility to obey the laws. And when I asked him, what about environmental laws? Do they have a responsibility to obey environmental laws that people have no defense against, silent violence of toxic pollution, for example? He said, yes, they have a responsibility. So when you kept parsing what he's saying, it wasn't quite as radically corporatist as you might expect. And the other point about Friedman that everybody misses is when he said corporations have the sole responsibility to make maximum money for their shareholders, he meant corporations who had risk in the game, that their money was at risk. And as you point out in an elaborate way, the private equity firms don't have much money at risk. They use other people's money and rip it off. Response?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that was really what made me want to write a book about private equity, this divorce in incentives. We think of free market economics as you, as a business owner, either make money or lose money based on the performance of your business. In private equity, the incentive structure gets so corrupted that that's not actually how it works. In fact, there are many tactics that allow private equity firms to make money at the expense of their own portfolio companies. So, for example, they very commonly use a tactic known as sale-leaseback agreements, which essentially means if you buy a company that owns a lot of real estate, for example, a chain store, you will sell off their real estate, you as the private equity firm, and pocket the profits. Then you strike a deal with whoever the new landlord is so that you're skimming some off the top, and the company is paying rent on the exact same land that they used to own. So in that case, you are actively weakening your own portfolio company to strengthen your own financial position. And that is just absolutely the inverse of what free market capitalism was supposed to be.
Exactly. Well put. You talk quite a bit about wealth inequity, wealth inequality. Could you define it for us?
Yeah, so wealth inequality is essentially the extreme gap between what ordinary workers are making and what their bosses are making. And I don't think many of your listeners would be surprised that that gap between what the workers are making and what the CEOs are making has grown bigger and bigger and bigger over time. But in the case of private equity, it's particularly extreme. And private equity firms, because they are 10 times more likely to go bankrupt as other kinds of companies, end up laying off huge swaths of people a disproportionate amount of the time. So maybe you have somebody making a minimum wage salary at Toys R Us, then you lay them off and they're making nothing. And so the wealth inequality problem grows even bigger.
So you define it by income, right? And just to put a number on it, there are CEOs of major companies whose names we all know who make $12 to $15 to $17,000 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Before noon on January 2nd, they make more than tens of millions of workers individually make in a year. Can you imagine that? Now, are you willing to define wealth inequality by standards of wealth in contrast to income?
Oh, sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of these folks at the top of private equity firms, it doesn't really matter whether they work or not. Their wealth is so extreme that they don't need to work. And so they're maximizing their profits really just for love of the game. They enjoy this. They are not working for money in the same way that most of us work to pay our bills and feed our children and all of that. So yes, the income, I mean, I think you point out correctly that the income is one thing, but just one's total holdings is actually the more important factor.
Can you spell out any reason why that is not part of the public discussion?
I think that very little about how private equity firms actually work is part of the discussion in a real way. And I think that is 100% by design of the private equity firms. They strongly prefer to operate in secrecy. They don't want people knowing how exactly they're making their money. They don't want people understanding the carried interest loophole. And so, because their lobbying power is so great, nobody has ever made a serious run at changing those circumstances. That was a big part of the reason I wanted to write this book. My theory was that people, by hearing stories about how this affects real people, would be much more interested in it than if I had asked people to pay $30 for an overview of how the system works. So essentially, I was trying to say, here are some characters that you can feel really invested in. And by doing that, you will understand how this system works, which is exactly what private equity does not want you to do. There was a very influential paper in 2005 by a scholar named Greta Krippner, essentially saying that our economy has become, the term she used was financialization. The economy has become financialized to the point that big companies no longer make their money by selling goods and services. They make their money by essentially financial tricks, clever investing, tax breaks, etc. And I think you're spot on that people don't really understand that that is how a company is making its money. That's why you think of Amazon can afford to sell things for way cheaper than anyone else, because selling things is not fundamentally how Amazon makes its money. It might have been in the early days, but that's not how it works now. So I think that's exactly correct, that nobody really understands, and I didn't understand before starting the reporting for this book, that that is how our economy works, that it's been financialized to the point that the goods and services are not even the point of the exercise. And yes, I mean, if I could wave a magic wand and make everybody understand that, I think that would make a huge impact in the voting patterns and in the political future of our nation.
Well, to add to your point, the unearned income lobby is very powerful. They not only have tax breaks that earned income people don't have, they have privileges and immunities you could write a book on that they've gotten through Congress and federal, state law, and local law. And before we get to your case study, where do you crank in cryptocurrency and private equity? Any relation there?
Oh, geez. Yeah. I mean, there is a lot going on there. There's private equity money in crypto. There's crypto money in private equity. It's all a nice little relationship that is benefiting both sides. I am far from a crypto expert, but yes, there are definitely a lot of tentacles stretching in both directions for sure.
You have 4 portraits of 4 people whose lives intersected with private credit abuses. And one of them is Natalia Contreras, who grew up in the Southwest and ended up working for the Gannett newspaper chain. Can you run by for our listeners this human interest interaction and how she's responding?
Yeah, so Natalia was a really interesting case study to me because she is somebody who is just absolutely passionate about working in local news. That was really all she wanted to do. She came to the US from Mexico when she was 13, fell in love with journalism in community college, and just really was dedicated to telling stories that often go untold. And so when she got a job originally working at her hometown paper in Corpus Christi, Texas, she was thrilled. The Corpus Christi paper got bought by Gannett while she was there. And that put her in sort of the Gannett network so that she was able to jump from there to a bigger paper, from there to a bigger paper. She spent the bulk of her career with Gannett at the Indianapolis Star, which is one of their flagship papers. And what she saw was that Gannett had no interest in the actual business of running newspapers, which by that point, Natalia's in her mid-30s now. So the newspaper industry was in trouble for some structural reasons that private equity certainly did not create. But what she learned was that Gannett, under private equity management, was not trying to solve any of those problems, was not trying to innovate, was not trying to find creative solutions. All they were trying to do was strip mine the newspapers, leave maybe a couple of employees, maybe 0 employees, this entire group of what scholars call ghost newspapers that continue building a subscriber base, but don't have a single reporter on staff. And that's a really effective way to goose your own profits without producing any journalism.
Well, what's interesting about this case study is Gannett, by the way, is the biggest owner newspaper chain in the country. They own newspapers in major cities and also small cities. And you say by the end of 2022, just 11,200 employees worked for Gannett in the United States, down from 24,338 at Gannett and its merger partner, Gatehouse, combined in 2018. That's quite a drop. That's my comment. Continuing your quote, in an effort to pay down its loans to Apollo and Fortress, the company had wiped out more than half its workforce in 4 years, end quote. Gannett owns USA Today, for example. I take it Apollo and Fortress are private equity companies?
Yes, that's exactly right. Fortress Investment and Apollo Global Capital.
So Gannett is no longer technically operated by a private equity firm, but it endured, whether willingly or unwillingly, a strip mining of its resources by these acquisitive private equity companies who came in and strip mined and got out and made a lot of money. So what is Natalia's situation now? How did she suffer from this?
So she suffered in several ways. She ended up the chair of the union at the Indianapolis Star, and she was in charge of trying to bargain a new union contract. The Indianapolis Star staff was absolutely getting fleeced from all sides by Gannett. Their salaries were too low to live on, frankly. One of the craziest details to me was they had to pay for parking at Indianapolis Star headquarters, which by that point was in an abandoned mall. And when the pandemic started and everybody was working from home, so nobody was using that parking, Gannett just kept charging them every month, $80 a month, to pay to park, which they were not doing. And so she was trying to negotiate a contract that just like provided for basic humane treatment of workers. I have seen the proposals, and they were not proposing anything exceptionally radical. And what happened was Gannett just wouldn't bargain with them, which is technically illegal. But we live in a world in which the NLRB is fairly toothless. I mean, even then was fairly toothless, certainly in the second Trump administration, even more so. So there was no real recourse to the fact that Gannett was just ignoring them, wouldn't meet with them, wouldn't send counter proposals. And so they were suffering with these salaries that, considering the cost of living, were effectively going down every year. And they just couldn't even get anybody to talk to them about it.
Just to clarify, one reason is that Gannett was so deeply in debt, it could say, well, it doesn't have the money to pay for more reporters or to pay for more reporters' salary. And that's true. It was very deeply in debt. But that's the result of the private credit shenanigans
Exactly.
that it was intertwined with. That makes your case stronger for Natalia, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think Gannett was in debt, but Gannett was in debt because of the loans that had been taken out in its name. And they're still paying off the interest for those loans, right? So Gannett is now a public company, but Fortress remains its largest shareholder by a mile. And so Fortress is still getting the payment from the old days, like still collecting on their management fees, and any profits that the company makes now line Fortress's pockets as well. So even though they're not technically the owners, they're still functionally in charge of the overall strategic direction of the company.
And you can see it in reading the newspapers that Gannett owns. They're getting thinner. They have fewer reporters reporting locally in the neighborhoods of these large cities. You know, it shows in terms of what the readers are paying for and what the community is supposed to be serviced for by having a newspaper. As you say in your book, newspapers that dry up in communities, you have fewer people showing up at town meetings, fewer people voting, fewer people running for office. It has a terrible effect on democratic institutions when you don't have a local newspaper. Let's go to Hannah.
Megan, there's got to be a hole in the Death Star. Every organization is going to have a weakness. So if I wanted to take down a Blackstone or a Carlyle group or a minor player in the field for an individual firm, not for a whole industry, how would you go about, can you do a leverage buyout of a private equity firm? How do you take them down?
I don't know if you could do a leverage buyout of a private equity firm. That would be interesting. I mean, most of them at this point, certainly at the bigger scale, are themselves publicly traded. But I actually think one of the most successful strategies is going at the pension funds, because private equity firms need pension fund money to continue operating. Even though it's the minority of any given deal, it's still total billions and billions of dollars. And crucially, public pension funds, which provide for teachers and nurses and firefighters to get their retirement after serving the community, those pension funds all have what they call participant representatives, which means ordinary teachers and nurses and firefighters, et cetera, who sit on that board. And those people, by virtue of being ordinary American workers, tend to be much more sympathetic to the arguments of other working people than billionaires are. And so there have been a couple of examples, including in the Toys R Us example, which I write about in the book, where groups of workers have gone to speak in front of public pension fund board meetings and actually gotten the pension fund boards to pull their money out of a given private equity firm. And so I think if that strategy were executed on a large scale, that would be a really quick way to breed a lot of panic among private equity firms. And even if not take them down in terms of bankrupt them, scare them into changing some of their most predatory tactics.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. This is a fascinating subject. It affects you wherever you live, and it will have more effect unless we get reforms from Congress that really mean something.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
We've been speaking with Megan Greenwell. We have a link to her work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we welcome James Zogby of the Arab American Institute to get his take on what is happening in Lebanon. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 17, 2026. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A Florida doctor has been indicted in connection with the death of a 70-year-old man who had the wrong organ removed during surgery. Dr. Thomas Shanknofsky, 44, was indicted by a grand jury on a charge of second-degree manslaughter in the August 2024 death of the man of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. That's according to a report from NBC News. Prosecutors alleged that in August 2024, during what was scheduled to be a laparoscopic splenectomy, Shanknofsky accidentally removed the victim's liver instead of his spleen. The surgery resulted in catastrophic blood loss and the patient's death on the operating table. Our duty is to follow the facts wherever they lead without fear or favor, said Walton County Sheriff Michael Atkinson. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. What is going on in Lebanon? David?
James Zogby is co-founder and president of the Arab American Institute and the director of Zogby Research Services, a firm that has conducted groundbreaking surveys across the Middle East. Since 1992, he has written a weekly column, Washington Watch, that is published in 12 countries. He's the author of several books, including Looking at Iran, The Rise and Fall of Iran in Arab Public Opinion, and Palestinians, The Invisible Victims. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, James Zogby.
Thank you very much for the intro, and thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, welcome back, Jim. I want to talk about Lebanon and what's going on with Israel bombing Lebanon. And there are three groups in the United States that relate to Lebanon. One of them is your Arab American Institute. Another is the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, ADC. Another is the Task Force for Lebanon. And ADC on April 8th put out a very powerful statement demanding immediate action from the United States as Israel escalates its U.S.-backed genocidal assault on Lebanon, a relentless siege marked by systematic destruction, dispossession, and the plundering of civilian life and infrastructure. It demanded an immediate end to Israel's bombing of Lebanon, that the U.S. states publicly and unequivocally that any ceasefire must include Lebanon, suspend U.S. military support to Israel, reject any attempt by Netanyahu to use Lebanon to reignite or widen war with Iran, and to impose concrete consequences for persistent attacks on civilians and continued violations of international law. It ended with the statement, quote, Israel's regime has made it clear that it will massacre, destroy, and escalate without limit in Lebanon so long as Washington is bankrolling it. So that's their position. What's your view as the founder of the Arab American Institute and one of the earliest champions of Palestinian rights, I might add, where you were on national television quite frequently and very courageously? What's your opinion now about what's going on in Lebanon, which exceeds our most imaginative scenarios of horror, as thousands are being killed, civilians mostly?
Not only thousands are being killed, Ralph, but there's a process underway of demolishing villages, obviously expelling lots of people, creating internal refugees and sectarian tension as a result of it. And clearly, as Israel has stated, and I think we have to believe them, that they actually want to annex the territory up to the Litani River and maybe even further. They call it a buffer zone, but we've heard that buffer zone stuff before. It's merely a way of taking new land and providing for opportunities for settlements. They believe that this is the biblical land of Israel, that it goes that far and maybe further. And what is troubling to me, I was thinking of my book, The Palestinians, The Invisible Victims, that Lebanon has become its own invisible victims. What is deeply troubling, I think, is that while on the left, there is today an increased appreciation of Palestinians, there's no attention paid to Lebanon at all, no sense of outrage. It becomes at best an afterthought. Oh, yeah, Israel's in Lebanon. And when you identify, as Israel tried to do, Palestinians with Hamas, you dehumanize, depersonalize. It doesn't become children. It doesn't become ancestral homes. It becomes a group that they're trying to eliminate. The same's been done with Lebanon, and there's been Lebanese complicity in that, I think, as well. This is Israel fighting Hezbollah. They're not fighting Hezbollah. They're fighting the entire people of the south of Lebanon. And by the way, destroying infrastructure and bombing beyond the south of Lebanon in order to impose their will. This is a fight against the people of Lebanon being masked as a fight against Hezbollah. And when you do that, you create a depersonalization, and people don't pay attention anymore to the human suffering. And I think therein lies the dilemma. So one of the things that we're planning, and I'm sorry it's taken us this long to get to it, are a series of programs from here to there. I'm going to call them. That's a tentative name. We've been in touch with people in Lebanon, been in touch with people here who have family and homes in Lebanon to create a virtual town hall so that people can tell the story of what's happening in their village, what's happening to their homes, what's happening to their families, because there's an awful lot of suffering, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of feeling, like I said, neglected. And that is deeply troubling. Do I think the Trump administration is going to do anything? No. There is no goodwill here. And the Lebanese who he has appointed in key positions in the administration are all complicit in this. And that is also, I think, deeply disturbing.
Well, there's a person in his inner circle. His name is Barak, and his family grew up in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. He's ambassador to Turkey. Is he playing any role at all to defend his ancestral land?
Of course not.
Listeners should know, by the way, that Israeli soldiers are in South Lebanon. They are blowing up entire villages, evacuating entire villages. It's scorched earth, and they want the Litani River, and they also want the gas off the coast, natural gas of Lebanon. So that's one-fifth of Lebanon we're talking about.
And about a third of the population. And frankly, that intention's been clear for a long time. This isn't the first time Israel occupied South Lebanon. It's not the first time they've tried to annex the territory. And you shouldn't say this on your radio show, but I'll do it anyway. They got their ass licked and they left in 2000. And it's starting to happen again. I mean, Israelis are being killed in South Lebanon. Israeli soldiers who are occupying, there's a drip, drip, drip. And we're going to see it just like we saw it back in the 1990s, where ultimately Israel gets worn down and leaves. Now, there were those who objected when Israel left back then. But frankly, I think they were forced to. And if I might, just as an aside, Israel has a hyperinflated sense of self that has been a function of two things. One is the entitlement that they've received from the last administration and this administration, both Biden and Trump. You do what you want to do, and here we're going to give you everything you need to get it done. And a megalomaniacal leader in the form of Benjamin Netanyahu, who believes that he is the vanguard. We don't need you, he said when he spoke here. You need us. We are defending Western civilization against the barbarians. That's us. The Arabs were the barbarians. And so fighting on 7 fronts, and he names the 7 fronts, Gaza and West Bank and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, and he goes on. And they are hard pressed right now. And as we saw ourselves in Vietnam, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, Israel is now getting PTSD reports that are deeply disturbing to them. They're getting suicides. They're getting an exhausted military. They're not exhausted with the weapons that they're losing because they're losing a lot and they're using a lot. They're getting emotionally and physically exhausted. Look, when the soldiers do what they've been doing, which is basically inhuman behavior. I mean, it's disgraceful behavior. It begins to eat away at the soul. You get these suicides. You get these emotional collapses. And what gets me upset, right, is that 72,000 Palestinians dead, a few Israeli soldiers having PTSD and trauma and committing suicide, that becomes a news story. My feeling has to be with the Lebanese and Palestinians.
Yeah, we've had a lot of programs on the vast death undercount in Gaza. It's over 600,000.
Can I just say something on that, Ralph? Because I've seen your numbers before. I've seen your reporting on it before. I am going to be an agnostic on the number because of one reason. I just don't want to think of it being 600,000. That would be about a third of the population of Gaza. And I'm already devastated by the number that the hospitals in Gaza report. I just don't want to think it's any greater than that. It's too devastating to think it. And we'll find out the number at some point and we'll deal with it. But what I'm dealing with is not just the numbers of those who are dead, but I'm dealing with the kids who are alive. And I cannot even imagine the 8-year-old, the 12-year-old kid who has known this now for 3 years, and what was before wasn't that great, and what's now is a nightmare. And the trauma, what toll that's taking, and thinking that we're going to have an entire generation of kids, those who have survived, growing up. And 10 years from now, Lord knows what the situation is. And we're now seeing the same thing in Lebanon. I've been talking with, I call them kids, but the folks that we brought over in 1983 and 4 and 5 in our Save Lebanon program, they came from the Israeli bombings in 92 for medical treatment. One of the little girls lived in my home with my kids for 7 months. She's been forced to move almost a half dozen times in Lebanon from the bombings with her daughter and her husband. These people are living in perpetual trauma. And like I said, I worry about what happens to them 10 years from now.
Well, because of your knowledge of history, the Israeli leadership under Netanyahu are claiming that they're doing this because Hezbollah is sending rather crude rockets into northern Israel. They have killed hundreds of times more Lebanese than these rockets have taken Israeli lives. But how do you respond to that historically? They're doing it, retaliating against Hezbollah.
Hezbollah is actually retaliating against them. Let's be clear. Hezbollah is not, Uncle Tom's Cabin Topsy. I just growed. Hezbollah didn't just growed. There were two main factors that produced Hezbollah. One was the sense of disenfranchisement of the Shia community in the south of Lebanon, which has to be considered and is real. I mean, when the French created the structure that was imposed upon the Lebanese, the Shia got the short end of the stick, and they lived with that short end of the stick. And yes, they were burdened by the fact that the PLO was the operative movement in control of the south of Lebanon for many years. And when the Israelis would bomb, when there'd be cross-border raids, they would pay a price. The Shia would pay a price. And they didn't have ministries. They didn't have the part of the budget that was important for them to get resources in that sectarian country of Lebanon. That was always a big factor for them. But then on top of it, when Israel occupied South Lebanon beginning in the 70s, once again, they were abused and they were ignored by the Lebanese Central Authority that in effect said, what are we going to do? You're down there. What the hell? And they let it go. And Israel was in occupation of South Lebanon from 78 to 2000, during which time, especially after 82, when the PLO was gone and Hezbollah was dealing with the devastation that Israel had wrought on South Lebanon during that period when they invaded, occupied, and terrorized people, Hezbollah grew as a movement in response. So this stuff about their Iran, but it reminds me of the Cold War when every national liberation movement in Africa was never looked at as an anti-colonial movement. They were always a Soviet tool. Anthony Lake, who became Clinton's national security advisor, wrote a book on how wrong it was, how mistaken it was for America to see every revolutionary movement in the world as simply an arm of the Soviets without looking at what were the conditions that spawned this movement in Guatemala or in Nicaragua or in wherever we're talking about in Asia. We're doing the same thing now. Oh, the Lebanese would be just fine if only Iran weren't there. Nonsense. The Lebanese are victims of a sectarian system that is corrupt, that is feudal, that has ignored the needs of many of the people in the country and allowed the South to be occupied with devastating consequences. Why are there so many Lebanese in Dearborn? Because these are folks from villages in the South who emptied out when Israel occupied and terrorized the people of that part of Lebanon. This is a victim people who are responding to having been victims.
Let's turn to another area where you have been a pioneer against the weaponization of the word antisemitism, which came to the public forefront sometime about 200 years ago in Europe. That was coined. Give us your view on this.
Right now, you use the word weaponization. I think that's absolutely right. It is being used to silence debate. When you lose a debate, you do everything you can to silence the debate. That is happening at universities. It's happening in the Democratic Party. It's happening in multiple places. When Ted Cruz said today that saying Christ is king is an anti-Semitic statement, I was like, what? Where are you coming from, man? What's this all about? And it is an effort to silence critics. In this case, he's silencing critics from the right. But when I hear on the DNC from other members who say to me, when you talk about Israeli genocide, that's anti-Semitic, it makes me uncomfortable. I said, you know what makes me uncomfortable? That genocide is actually taking place. And it makes me equally uncomfortable that you won't admit it or even want us to talk about it. I don't want to play victimhood Olympics with these characters, but I can tell you stories of death threats I got and that my family got, and that efforts to have my son fired and have me removed from positions that I'd gotten because I was the Arab guy. When meeting at the Carter White House with Vice President Mondale and of ethnic leaders, and 3 days after the meeting, I was called by the White House to say, we're so sorry, but Jewish groups complained that there was a pro-Palestinian Arab in the meeting. We can't invite you to the follow-up meeting. When we were uninvited from the National Steering Committee of the 20th Anniversary March on Washington, King's March on Washington, because Jewish groups said, if the Arabs march, we won't march. When I could go down a whole litany of this stuff, and we've won some, lost some, but the bottom line is they're feeling uncomfortable now because they're losing and they don't want to lose. They're not used to losing. And because they're losing, they have to find a weapon to use back. And the weapon is, oh, you're making us uncomfortable. Well, I'm sorry. I've spent my life in discomfort because you guys tried to silence me. In '88, when I did the platform for Jackson on Palestine, people in the party leadership came to me and said, we need you to withdraw your membership from the DNC as a DNC member because people are going to come after Dukakis for having a pro-Palestinian Arab on the DNC. No one's asked somebody who supports Israel and what they're doing. No one asked them to leave the DNC. They asked me to leave the DNC. So, yeah, we are the victims here. And I'm not going to give up speaking out about this issue because now, is there an anti-Jewish behavior? Of course there is. And there are people who say really awful and terrible things about Jews who generalize being Jewish into some kind of evil something or other. The Jews own the banks. The Jews own this. The Jews. That is anti-Jewish bigotry, bottom line. But saying Israel's committing genocide, I'm sorry, that's what they're doing.
We've been speaking with James Zogby, founder of the Arab American Institute. Thank you very much,
Thank
Jim.
you so much, Ralph. I'd love to do it again.
For sure.
I want to thank our guests again, Megan Greenwell and James Zogby. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
Stand up, step up, you ought to step up. Rise up, I know you ought to rise up and stand up.